and welcome to this month's Power Speaking Live event. Thank you so much for investing your time today in what is certain to be a very rich, insightful conversation on a topic that's relevant to all of us. I'm Carrie Beckstrom, the host of the Power Speaking Live event, which is held monthly, and the CEO of Power Speaking Incorporated. Today, we're going to be discussing best practices and advice for leaders and employees to successfully support, communicate, and adapt to change. Change, of course, is a constant in both our professional and personal lives. And done right, it can propel the business forward in new and exciting ways. Done poorly, it can be incredibly disruptive and stressful. So I'd love to hear from you. Share with us in chat just one type of change going on within your organization right now. It could be due to a technology implementation, a structural change, a DEI initiative, new product rollout, global expansion, downsizing, you name it. So if you would, please share with us just one type of change. Personal changes, new CMO, new leadership change, process changes, digitalization, executive leadership change. Let's just hear a few more. Office move, new roles and role clarity. Yeah, there's countless drivers to change that we have going on every day, again, both personally and professionally. Now, when you consider whatever change it was that you shared, I'd also like you to share what you believe is one of the most critical factors to that change succeeding. What's one of the most critical factors? Input from those impacted, yes. Transparency, communication, getting all on board, buy-in, wide and deep communication. Yes, Sherry, wide and deep. I like that. Honesty, transparency. Great. Okay, thank you. Those are all aspects that we're going to be discussing and naturally spot on. In my experience, one of the most critical success factors to any transformation initiative is employee commitment. And the various things you mentioned are essential to gaining employee commitment and buy-in. And that's becoming increasingly more difficult as the rate or pace of change accelerates. I read a study recently by Gartner that was really sobering. And what they found is that 73% of change-affected employees report experiencing moderate to high levels of stress. And those that are suffering from stress due to change perform 5% worse than the average employee. So clearly, change done wrong takes a toll on us personally, and it's very costly to the business. On a positive note, research and experience proves that effective change communication can counter those trends and help to ensure a very, very successful transformation and positive outcomes. So with that, let's get into it. I have the pleasure of introducing to you two expert panelists with us here today. First, we have Sandhya Ren. Sandhya is the Chief Transformation Officer at Vitech Systems Group. And in that role, she's responsible for driving transformation initiatives to accelerate growth within her organization. That's a lofty, tall order. She has a lot of experience in this area. Prior to joining Vitech, Sandhya was the Vice President of Cloud Transformation for Guidewire Software. Sandhya is also a valued client of Power Speaking. and she has supported the growth and development of women throughout her organization at Guidewire and Vitech by bringing in our Confident Speaking for Women program. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sandia.
Thank you, Carrie.
Also with us, we have Mary Schaefer. Mary and I had the pleasure of working together for, gosh, Mary, over 15 years.
Yeah, I'm afraid
while
to say
at
it.
80. Pardon?
I'm almost afraid to say how long it was.
Yeah. Suffice it to say, it was a really long time, but it was great time together. And Mary continues to be a dear friend and colleague. Mary is the Vice President of Strategic Advisory Services for ADP, where she is responsible for helping clients across sectors throughout the globe successfully manage transformation and change. She also is a frequent keynote speaker at various industry and ADP events and has delivered countless workshops on this very topic. So you've got some real experts at the ready here. And take advantage of it. We, of course, have some questions that we have prepared, but we'd love to hear from you. So if at any point throughout this conversation, you have a question or advice that you'd like to offer, by all means, please put it in chat. Now, what I think would be helpful to give your advice and recommendations some context is just to share a little bit more about your background, especially as it relates to this topic. So how about if we start with you, Sandia?
Okay, sure. So first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity, Carrie. It's really an honor to be here. As Carrie mentioned, I am the Chief Transformation Officer at Vitech Systems Group. Vitech provides cloud solutions for the retirement, group benefits, and investment markets. And we're about 30 years old, and we're going through a number of larger scale changes right now that are mostly focused on growth and scale. So in my role, I help the team to identify, prioritize, and really execute on these transformation initiatives that tend to be longer, more cross-functional, more involved as compared to day-to-day operational activities. And then I just generally try to help the team navigate this time of change, which, as we'll discuss, can be kind of tricky. I've been at Vitech for about 9 months, so it hasn't actually been that long that I've formally had change management or transformation in my job responsibilities. Prior, when I was at Guidewire Software, I was there for almost 20 years, and there I had the opportunity to really start and build up and enable a number of different teams and products. And it was through those opportunities that I really kind of organically gained the experience of change management and communication, because my team was always, we were defining something new or evolving our processes quickly, and all of that requires a lot of strong communication. So I learned sometimes the hard way, what works and what doesn't work. So I love thinking about this, really enjoy hearing and learning about this. So thank you for having me. I really look forward to our discussion.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Sandia. And the type of changes that you're trying to lead at Vitech that are intended to drive growth and scalability, as you pointed out, are very complex and tend to be more long-term in nature. Mary, how about you?
Well, thank you again for having me. Very honored to be on Power Speaking Live. No pressure at all, right? My whole career has been around change management, communications, and transformation and marketing. So I've been at ADP for 16 years. The first half of my career at ADP was running marketing and communications for one of our business units, and that was all things internal and all things external communications. And then as I grew my career, I was recruited into our strategic advisory services team, which is a group of experts. So think of it as almost a SWAT team of experts that can consult with our clients on a variety of topics across human capital management. So things like payroll, benefits time, all the things you recognize with what ADP does. But my role on the team is to help our clients with change management and communications. So that means I am client facing all the time and host workshops with clients on a variety of topics as it relates to human capital management or transformation. So sometimes that could be merger, acquisition, divestiture. It could be a technology change, all the things. I mean, I wrote down like 10 things you all put in the chat. And I think I probably had a workshop on each one of those. So very passionate about transformation and communications. And what I find with what I do in helping the clients that I work with is that nobody is a Sandia, right? Like not everybody has a Sandia to help them with change management and communications. So a lot of the executives and practitioners I'm working with are kind of like, well, change management and communications is my night job, or I don't have any resources. So that's why I love workshops like this, where we can give you some practical tips as to how to handle change management and communications, and give you some really good tips and tricks, and talk about things that have worked well for us and things that haven't worked so well. So delighted to be here with you. I do have a furry coworker. So as she starts talking, I'll just throw treats at her and let Sandia talk. So nice to be here. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Mary. And she's a Frenchie. So if we hear a little bit of snoring, I'm not going to be alarmed and think it's a participant that we're boring. And I really appreciate that you pointed out the fact that so often we're responsible for leading change initiatives, small, medium, and large, without the benefit of someone whose whole job is devoted to that. And
Right.
even if you have the benefit of someone like Sandia, who's a transformation change leader, you still have a significant role as a leader or a contributor. So this has broad applicability. So let's start fundamental, because I think this term can be interpreted in a variety of ways. So just for level setting, Mary, when working with your various clients, how do you define change management communication?
I'm glad you asked that, because I find that so many people have different definitions of what change management and communications are. And there's a variety of definitions, but the way I look at it and how I position it with clients is that any big or small initiative that really needs to have a behavior change, whether that's adopting a new technology, a new policy or process, integration of merging entities, that requires a very thoughtful and broad scale communications and change management plan. And I like to look at it as making sure that you've got the right plan in place. And a lot of times people don't even know where to start, right? Like they're thinking about the project and they're not necessarily starting with thinking about the change management and the communication. So I look at it as a way that we're trying to drive change, you're trying to drive information, awareness, thinking through the what's in it for them. And I'll talk more later about some of the ways that we roll out and host those workshops, and giving you some steps on how to put together a very pragmatic approach to change management. You don't have to have, a 20,000 page document, right, to get it done, but having a vision, understanding stakeholders, thinking about what's changing and why, and really thinking through the ways in which you're going to reach all of your key constituents who are impacted by the change. And oftentimes that's not always obvious until you start, what I say is peeling back the onion around the change and what needs to be done. Sandia, what would you say? What's your opinion on that, on the definition?
Yeah, I think very similarly to you, Mary, in that I think about who might be impacted, and if it impacts the way somebody does their job or even their life, then I think change management communication is needed, even if it's a small thing. Because I think a lot of times we think, oh, big organizational changes, like some of the things that we saw the team list here. But smaller things like a small process change or even a name change can require change management communication.
Yeah,
Right.
I read some research recently about how 78% of employees say that there's not enough communications and change management effort within their organizations, which is not totally surprising to me anyway, because I see it every day. But I thought that was an interesting stat, and it shows you that employers and employees really need to focus on this to continue to support retention, especially right now with the great reshuffle, resignation, whatever you want to call it. There's like 10 names out there. But this is so important as you're thinking about engaging your employees' satisfaction and preventing turnover.
Absolutely, Mary. And to validate that even further, and many of you have probably seen this research, research done by McKinsey has found that an alarmingly 70% of change initiatives fail. 70%. And we talked about at the outset the cost that that can have on the bottom line, as well as the individuals and their well-being. So why do you think that is, Sandia? And by the way, the key contributing factor is ineffective communication associated with that change. So we know it's critical. We know the impacts of doing it poorly, yet we so frequently fail. So in your experience, Sandia, why do you think that is? What are some of the barriers to getting this right?
It's funny, Carrie, because actually this role that I have is something that myself working with the CEO, we kind of put together. And as he was sharing to the rest of our executive team and the board the need for this role, that was actually the stat that he used to say, this is why we need it. We need this focus. We need this focus on communication and change management. So, no pressure for me. The reality is that it's very hard. Change management is very hard. You have to figure out when to communicate and how to communicate. And if something is constantly changing because it's new and you're evolving, that makes it even harder. This day and age, we hear a lot about agile, right? Agility, agile methodology. So how do you know when to get the right people in the loop? And I think that all makes it very difficult. I saw one in here that somebody had put changes to product offerings. So that's something that my team and I did quite a bit. And I like to joke, not really joke, but tell the story that when we made a change to a process or a product offering, we'd want to tailor that communication based on the team that is receiving that information, right? And since there's so many different functions in a company, then we could end up having, 18 different conversations with 18 different teams, tailoring it so they understood how it impacted them. Well, by the time you get through all 18 conversations, you've made some more changes and you're ready to start over again. So do you start over again? And then that leads to the next question of how often you communicate. Right. You mentioned that employees feel like you don't get enough communication, but I think those of us who are in a role of being responsible for communicating are worried about over communicating. So I have one of my close friends, she was the head of education services at Guidewire, and she would always remind us that just because you did a presentation or you sent an email out doesn't mean you're done, right? You're done enabling, you're done communicating. Doesn't mean that people really absorbed it, will retain it, and will act upon the information. So how do you find that balance, right? Of how often that you remind people. You don't want to be too repetitive because then people might tune out as well. I think that makes it hard as well. It's almost like you want to find the right balance of proactive communication versus letting people have the ability to just in time find that information. So could you do, if there's a way that you can trigger somebody saying, oh, I think there was an email about that, or I thought somebody had a presentation, and then have a way to go and look up that information that you shared. That's almost kind of like the engagement model that you want.
Yeah.
So, I think overall change is just hard. And at the root, it really requires being comfortable with the unknown. And I think helping the team be comfortable with this and willing to come along for the ride is a key to success and change.
Yeah. Oh, Sandia, you brought up so many factors that make it really obvious why this is really tricky. And Mary, you mentioned in your definition of change management that at the end of the day, it's about behavior change, and behavior change is challenging. So you talked about timing, you talked about messaging, you talked about the fact that it's often a moving target. Another thing that was coming to my mind that I think makes it really difficult to get this right is employees' capacity to take it in with all the other noise and information overload that you're competing with. How do you get your particular message to the top? I see something came through chat. Let's see.
It was
David
talking
Binder.
about, yeah, stakeholders.
Go ahead.
And how important. I could go on about that, right? So how important it is to really think about who needs to know what and really understanding who your stakeholders are, right? Because it's not
Yeah.
just leaders, managers, frontline associates. It could be vendors, it could be competitors, it could be the market. So there's a lot of different things that you need to think about. Totally agree with you on that. And that's part of our process. When I meet with clients is I spend a good bit of time on stakeholder analysis.
Yeah, thank you for that point, David, knowing first and foremost who is impacted and how. So let's build on that, Mary. And this is a very broad question. So, share your top tips as it relates to how do you effectively come up with a change management plan and then effectively implement and modify that, because Sandia mentioned things are constantly evolving.
Right. And Lauren just put in the chat, understanding how people learn and take in information. I know there were stats around, 80% of people, understand what they see, 10%, what they hear, and 20%, really what they read. So, you can read all kinds of stats, but just understanding that you have to have a multi-touch approach. But the way that I work with clients is to really start thinking about, what's the change, what's changing, and why is it changing? And then really understanding things you need to do first, like have an executive sponsor, depending on the size of the change, right? And having perhaps a change champion network to help you evangelize the message and the change to the field, because it's one thing for one group to send out messages. Maybe it's from corporate, maybe it's from one of the divisions, but it's nice to have boots on the ground, so to speak, to help support you as you're moving through the change. The way that I work with clients is I'll have a workshop with them. We'll start with that, what's changing and why. And then we'll talk about the goals and objectives around the change management efforts to really understand what is the behavior we're trying to drive, what is changing, who is impacted. And then we'll talk about those stakeholders and really kind of understanding who all needs to know what and why, and thinking about maybe those non-obvious audiences. So for me, when I'm working with HR executives, one of the audience could be, people on a leave of absence. What if you have a big change, right, that impacts everybody and you've got 30% of your people out on a leave, right? And thinking about folks like, are there spouses or domestic partners that you need to get information to? Do you have a union population? So we really try to understand, all of the audiences, and then how does the change specifically impact them? And then we talk about challenges and opportunities. So thinking about, are there things that could be barriers to rolling this out? For the number one thing I hear from my clients is, hey, half my organization either doesn't have access to email, they're not issued a company email, or they're on the floor in the field, not behind a desk all day. How do we get to them? And then on the flip side, let's think about the opportunities of positioning this in a way that's going to be clear, concise, and explain what's in it for them. And then we talk a little bit more about timeline, how to measure success, and we go through all of the ways in which our clients engage with their different constituents so that we can put together a comprehensive plan for change management and communications that's going to be very easy to follow, and make sure that you're staying on top of all of the different ways that you can get information to the field, and of course, thinking about measurement. So one of the things I always talk to clients about is just make sure there's a feedback loop so that you can collect, information, feedback, the good, the bad, the ugly, and respond to it. And that's how kind of my top tips on how to develop and implement a plan.
Excellent. A lot packed in there. Sandia, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, listening to Mary describe that whole framework, which I think is great. I think that same framework is applicable to like the smaller changes that I was talking about as well, right? Even if it's, again, just a small process change, or a new mailing list or something that people need to be aware of. The framework that she describes and thinking through who might be impacted. And then in the chat, I know one of the key success items somebody had put was input from those impacted. Again, I think that's applicable here as well, thinking through and really maybe getting some input from people who are going to be affected by it. All makes a lot of sense in putting together the communication.
Excellent. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about the process that you go through in working with clients or leading your own change initiatives in coming up with the core messages associated with the change, because we know that something that's really critical for alignment and understanding and buy-in is that consistency of why we're doing this and how it's going to affect the organization, while at the same time, the need to successfully tailor that message to each specific audience. And as you pointed out, Maria, there can be many, many, many different audiences, both internally and externally. So a lot in that question. Let's start with share a little bit about the process of coming up with the core messages associated with a change. Mary?
Oh, I thought we were going to give that one to Sandia, but I'll definitely take it.
Well, Sandia, do you want to lead?
Oh, no, go ahead, Mary.
No, I'll start and then I'll let her jump in because I know we both have a lot of ideas on this and get very passionate. We could spend all day talking about this, but I think it's important, the stakeholder analysis and understanding what's changing, when and why is going to help you develop those core messages. Because it can't be a one size fits all. I mean, the change is likely not going to affect everybody the same as it does. So really got to think through that. How I do it is to really brainstorm based on what I learned from the client and then kind of start mapping out what's most important to communicate and keeping things short, sweet, to the point, using plain language, considering things like, does anybody need to have things, translated? How are we going to communicate these? How are we going to deliver them? And then as you're building those messages, test them. So I think you just talked about the importance of engaging your audiences. So when I do this, I'm always like, hey, let's test this, make sure you understand it. What do you have questions on? What jumps out at you? And even things like acronyms and wording that might be familiar to you as leaders or practitioners may not be so clear to everybody that you're communicating with. So I think that's important to test the message, to keep it high level and making sure you're not missing the mark. I used to do that all the time in marketing. I do it all the time in my current role, and it really helps you keep things real and making sure that there's nothing in there that is going to either confuse or upset any of your audiences. Sandia, you've got strong feelings on this too. What do you think?
I think in terms of the core messages, it's most important to keep the number of messages small, because you just want the key takeaway, especially if it's a very big change. People are probably going to be a little shocked. And so if there are too many words, and too much information, you still want to boil it down to these are the core messages. And then makes it easier to cascade that information and make sure that those messages remain consistent through that cascade. And that is another thing that I found really beneficial, is having a good cascading communication framework. So whether that is through your org structure, where you have managers speak to their team members, and then their team members cascade information down. That's one way that works, but it's important to have that structure, I think to explicitly have that structure in place and know how you're going to get the information out to everyone. And, you know, depending on the information, maybe just an email blast is enough. But if there's something that is important that requires communication of core messages that are tailored, I think having a cascading framework set up for your organization is really important.
Excellent. So we heard a lot there. The importance of plain, simple language, limiting it to the main key points, and testing it. Obviously, your marketing background is coming into play there, Mary, and the cascading framework so that you have the ability to have consistency of the main messages while at the same time really tailoring that message to the different audiences. And Mary has added, I like that simplicity, few core messages for the big picture. You want everyone singing from the same songbook. Well said. Mary must be part of a power speaking organization that specializes in clear communication that's consistent. So one of you talked about really being clear on the WIFM, what's in it for me. And wherever possible, you obviously want to highlight the benefits, the positive aspects of the change. The reality is sometimes change has adverse impact on some or many employees. So what advice do you have for communicating bad news associated with a change? Sandia?
Yeah, well, it's it's never fun. So I'll just put it out there. It's hard to do it well. I think you have to accept that to some degree that people will feel bad. And I know for those of us, for some of us, myself included, that can be hard. So what I found is that you want to just, in a very straightforward manner, get it all out there and kind of say it fast and say it all, and then say it honestly. So I saw some of the, again, key success factors: honesty, transparency. I think that's really important. I think people appreciate that, and they can see through it if you're trying to sugarcoat it or if you're trying to message it another way, especially, you know, in within internal teams where you know each other, you've worked together for so long. And so I found, you know, just a straightforward, open, honest communication, come out with that in the first place. And this is not specific just to bad news, but especially with bad news, I think it's very important to arm managers and leads and, you know, other people on the team who people will tend to go to if they have concerns, because this is a situation where there probably will be a lot of one-on-one conversations or just mumblings at the water cooler, you know. So it's important to take the time to prepare your organization and like key people within the organization, having those core messages before kind of sharing it with everyone.
That is so true. In fact, Rachel just put in the chat, and this, I talk about this all the time. Biggest mistake I've seen is leadership trying to put a positive spin on bad news rather than being real. One of the tips I always share with clients is, you know, don't sugarcoat or spin that bad news. The first rule of this kind of communications is tell it all, tell it fast, and be transparent about it, right? Because if I say something goes out at the organization that says, Jane Smith is retiring in 2 months, and yay, Jane, thank you for your years of service. And like you all know, Jane's 29, so she's clearly not retiring, right? You're just trying to make it sound like better than it actually is, or making assumptions about people. So I've had workshops over the years with clients. I'll give you one example real quick. A client making a pay frequency change, which is super exciting, I know, but it's really a big deal because you're touching people's pay. And I have one client who said, well, we're going to offer a relief loan or some sort of help for directors and below. And I said, well, you can't assume that directors and above all manage their money the same way, or that They don't have, other obligations. You don't know how they manage anything with their money, and you're just making assumption. Plus, the downstream impact of doing it that way means the directors and below will find out about that loan to the others and get upset, right? And having a downstream impact that you didn't intend to cause because you didn't think through the positioning or messaging, and you're assuming how people manage their money. So and they actually ended up changing their mind and offering the loan to all of their associates, which I think saved them some heartache.
Great example, really thinking through those downstream effects. And we talked at the beginning that one of the most critical success factors to an effective change is employee commitment. You're not going to succeed at gaining employee commitment if you can't be trusted. So as you both said, and Rachel pointed out, if you're trying to sugarcoat or spin the message, you are losing your credibility out of the gate. Not the way to approach it. Be honest, be real, be empathetic. So let's talk about how best to manage change, communication in this hybrid workforce that so many of us are contending with us. For some of us, we've been doing it for a very, very long time. For some, it's very new and there's still a lot of adjustment. And we all know that we often hear in a hybrid workplace that those employees who are 100% remote often feel disconnected from those who work out of the office. So when you're coming up with your change management plan and executing on it, are there any things you do differently or specific advice you have for effectively communicating that change and gaining buy-in and commitment from those remote employees? And conversely, are there changes for how you might manage that communication for those that are working out of the office? Mary, we'll start with you. What's ADP up to? 50,000 employees?
52, 55, something like that.
Okay.
Ours is a little bit of a different scenario because most of us are, we all mostly have computers, right? But we're still hybrid. So, some of the things that I've seen, ADP do is just make sure that they're continuing to reach out to associates, not only on site, but also that are also hybrid, but not forgetting to be inclusive. So for example, if someone sends out a thing to everyone and says, oh, we're having an ice cream social at XYZ location. Well, what are you doing for your home shored employees? We call them home shored employees here. But I've seen things over the years where, the last couple of years especially, where some employers are really trying to send the things to the home, be inclusive in terms of, hey, we're sending you a gardening kit for the spring, or a pumpkin carving thing for the fall, and they include everybody. There is always that chance, and I see it a lot with clients that I work with, is that us versus them mentality, whatever it is, if it's a hybrid work environment or not. But again, it goes back to thinking about your audiences and what's important to them, making sure to be very inclusive, and not forget about those folks who are at home, and also thinking that the folks who could be in the office are envious of the folks who are working at home. So how do we make sure that they feel like everything is inclusive and fair? But Sandhya, I mean, you're probably living this every day. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you make some great points that I can completely relate to, because even in my previous company, I was part of our professional services team. So that meant that I pretty much traveled to customer sites every week. So those of us in consulting could live anywhere. So we were in a situation where really the product and kind of the core functions teams would be in the offices, whereas professional services, a non-trivial part of the company, was spread out all through the country. And early days, it was very easy to see that everything's kind of office centric, right? And even the policies, HR policies that we had were office centric or headquarter centric. And really, I think the pandemic changed things, but because of that
Mhm.
experience, I've always been very cognizant of people who are not in an office and how do we make sure. And the things that you talked about, Mary, sending things out to everybody. If you have something in the office, then, make sure other people receive it as well. And you can give out gift cards for people to get lunch and get lunch together. I really like that the pandemic has actually opened up a lot of options around that. But one thing I was going to mention with this question is it was really interesting to see how the dynamics of meetings even changed in the pandemic. So right now we all have our own box here, right? And I can see everybody, and it's pretty easy for me to see if Mary wants to say something, or we actually had David on camera if he was going to say something, and the body language I can see. But it's very different if you have the majority, like 70% of the people in an office, in a conference room, and then a few people on Zoom. Outside of that, I feel that it's a lot harder for the people who are remote to speak and to be heard and to get time. So it was really interesting for me to see that shift happen through the pandemic, where we all ended up on Zoom, and then it almost felt like there was much more kind of equal opportunity. So now going back into the office, as offices reopen, I think we're more in that situation of the hybrid, as you're saying, Carrie. And so I think it's very important then that we have a way to still make sure everybody feels like they can get that time, that air time, and get their say.
Most definitely. And gosh, Sandia, you're hitting on one of the biggest challenges that we're helping our clients with right now, and it's twofold. One is leaders and employees all of a sudden going back to an in-person environment and feeling really ill-prepared and out of practice in terms of how you effectively deliver a presentation, facilitate a discussion in person. Just like children are having anxiety about going back to in-person school, we're experiencing the same thing as working professionals. And then to your point, the hybrid dynamic is really, really tricky. It takes quite a bit of finesse and skill to be able to effectively lead an impactful discussion and get to the result that you're driving for while helping everybody to feel included. So it's quite an art and takes some practice and technique. So I want to talk about measuring success. Mary, you talked about, one of the key fundamental steps you take when coming up with a communication change plan is being really, really clear on the outcomes. What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with this change initiative? And then how do we communicate effectively to ensure that's accomplished? So who would like to start by sharing your best practices approaches for how you actually know whether your change communication is working?
I'm happy to start, and then Sandia can jump in. I just put in the chat too, and because I didn't want to take up too much of I was looking at the clock, but one of the things we need to remember with this hybrid workforce is some companies have always been that way. So 60% of the US workforce is considered deskless. So you've got, a lot of you think about retail, restaurant, manufacturing, healthcare, the list goes on and on. I find when I'm working with clients, they sometimes lose sight of those constituents that may not have an email or a way to get information quickly and have Zoom or things like that. So taking into account that deskless workforce and planning for it is important. And that's where your HR business partners, your people managers are really going to be crucial to making those folks feel part of the organization, engaged and not forgotten, because they're not. This is a huge part of the American workforce, and we can't just presume every time that everybody has email. But in terms of measurement, I think it's, first of all, you got to have some goals in mind as to what you're going to measure, right? Is it data? Is it focal point reviews? Is it focus groups? That kind of thing. But having some sort of feedback loop in place so that you can listen, hear, and understand and see, are there things that we need to clarify? Like if we're getting 100 phone calls on, I don't know, password resets or something equally as exciting, that signals to you that there is a need for additional training or information, or that something's not working or not resonating. So I'd like to make sure that we're looking at everything from anecdotal feedback. Maybe you do some focus groups with your managers, your change champions, listening tours, to get out there into the field, surveys. I've had clients do all kinds of things to help measure. Of course, one thing that's interesting that's evolved over the last couple of years is the annual, employee surveys are now turning more into, quarterly surveys and even weekly, depending on your organization. So, looking at those things. But the biggest thing I always advise is if you're going to ask for feedback, then you're going to want to respond to it. So again, you don't want to undermine your credibility by saying, "Oh, didn't you think that rollout was great?" And you get some feedback and you just ignore it. That's really disheartening for employees who took the time to give the feedback. It makes it seem like you're not listening or that you don't care, which is not true. Because if you're thinking about change management and communications, that's terrific. But you want to make sure that you're adjusting and being agile and responding, and not just right after the event happens or whatever your project is, but continue to ask and to learn so that you can adjust as needed.
Excellent advice. Sandia, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that at the airport after you go through security and they make you like, how did I do today? And you get like
The smiley face, yeah.
Yeah, the smiley face is just like the pulse surveys. But you're right. I think that's I see a lot more of that. Just like 2 minutes, tell us how you're doing, how you're feeling. But I agree that acting on the feedback is really, really important. I think for me, what is most important, a very key sign of success is buy-in, which I also saw in the chat earlier. As we've been talking about, change really comes down to, it can be a mindset change and then a cultural change, behavioral change. So there are KPIs that, you could probably come up with to try to measure that. But for me, success is when you see that the team has really bought in and embraces the vision that is being set forth. And then, very independently and proactively come up with ideas and executes on them, aligned with the new direction. I think that's the most exciting part of change, but to me, it's a sure sign that, the communication is working well.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you start seeing people proactively contributing and influencing that change, it's working and it's taking hold. So we talked about different channels, feedback loops. A question I have, how do you squelch rumors? Any advice for that?
That's a tough one. I think that having regular communications that are consistent is important. I think leaders and managers play a big role in that, and kind of helping people understand, and this isn't a conspiracy theory. We're not trying to torture you, right? This is a project that's ultimately going to benefit us. I think people are always going to have, but I think communicating clearly and with honesty and transparency and in a regular way is a good way. I think, if you start to hear more and more people, putting a rumor out there, is to kind of maybe even have a discussion, with folks to understand what's making you think this, what questions do you have, how can I answer? One of the things in my workshops, I'll usually ask whatever my client contact is, who are the detractors in the room? And they're like, oh, this person, or we don't know. But I like hearing from detractors, because you take the person who's, always negative about everything, or maybe they're just, realists, right? But making sure you get their perspective or anything else that might pop up that you weren't expecting, and then you can plan for it in your communications. But you're always going to have people talking, right? So the best thing you can do is, communicate multiple times, multiple ways, different modalities. Don't presume that everybody takes information in the same way. So I had a client, yesterday, a grocery store chain, and we were on a workshop, and they were just insistent that their older workforce, average age 44. I was like, wow, that's a really old workforce. Can't use technology, right? So just making sure that you're consistent, you're communicating, at least, 7 times, the rule of 7, communicate 7 times, but don't stop there. Once the project is live, keep going, keep reinforcing your messages. But Sandhya, I know, you're in the hot seat, being the Chief Transformation Officer, so you've probably seen a lot of this. What do you all do?
Yeah, it's really hard, especially when a lot of change is happening. And I think trust is the most important thing here. And rumors will come about when people are skeptical of, the motives and what the company's trying to do. So developing that sense of trust within the organization helps a lot. I agree with Mary, people are always going to talk, but if you have, just very real, candid conversations, open and often, I think that helps, because then there will be a couple brave souls who will be like, hey, I heard XYZ, is it true? And then, you can address it. So making that space and giving the team that opportunity and creating that trust and showing that you will tell them that. So this is going back to the don't sugarcoat things, because when they see through it, they're just going to be like, okay, so what's going on for real, right? And
right.
So I think all of that will help. Again, I don't think it will squash them entirely, but I think it helps a lot.
And Rachel just put in the chat, I'm sorry, Carrie, Rachel just said, never underestimate the speed and power of the rumor mill. And that is so true. And she says, timeliness is key. I totally agree. And I was just thinking too, it can't be one person owning the change, right? So often, it gets planted on one person. Like, we are going to have so-and-so be the change leader, but you need a support system, whether you call those, change champions, you tap into managers or others, but it takes a village, right, to drive change, especially depending how complex or maybe controversial the change is. Having other folks to help you is true. And agree, Rachel, timeliness and transparency are critical as well.
For sure, for sure. Another thing that can contribute to rumors surfacing is a lack of communication and neglecting the importance of ensuring everybody feels connected to the pulse of the organization and what's going on. Because if you're not communicating, people will come up with their own stories. So timeliness and all of that. I also really want to stress, because both of you have talked about the importance of cascading, the role that so many people have in the organization as it relates to the communication and the support. And that takes capability development. So that's another thing that has to be taken into account, is how do we support our leaders, our frontline managers, in effectively handling this communication, especially, Sandhya, like you brought up, when it's bad news. You need to be proactive and help them be prepared to respond to the concerns and the questions. So I can't believe it. We've got 7 minutes. So in the short time we have remaining, I'd love if you could share your parting advice associated with this topic. So why don't we start with you, Sandhya?
Okay. So I don't know how many times I've said, oh, it's really hard and it's tough in this session. So I'm going to flip it around a little bit and maybe be a little more positive. But the reason I took on the transformation officer role at Vitech is because I think change is actually very exciting, and it's a huge mine of opportunity if the team is given the right vision and the right tools and the right support. I always tell, it's funny because I always tell my peers, transformation is not something that me, myself, and I sitting over in the transformation office is going to make happen. We have to get the entire team excited, right? We have to get them on board with where we're going, embracing the vision, and then really helping them see that there are huge opportunities for them. As a leader, I've always thought that one of the best things that I can do is to get out of the way. And I think that, and I've seen some really incredible new ideas and really what turned out to be successful endeavors come out of a time of change because people were given that space to think about how to do things differently. So in addition to all of the things that we talked about today, which I thought were wonderful, I'd say it's also important to keep the team in mind, get them excited, and show them that even though change is hard and it can be very tough, it can also be really good and very exciting for them as well.
Excellent point. And nice to leave with that very positive emphasis. How about you, Mary?
I totally agree with what Sandhya said. And I just add that one of the things I always advise is just don't forget about the communications after the project has launched. Oftentimes, think about something like, I'm just relating this to the HR world because that's where I sit, but you think about something about like benefits open enrollment, right? So your HR and benefits team probably works a good part of the year on plan design and communications. And then after that open enrollment period, they might be off in Tahiti, right? Like we're done. And that's very tempting, but remember to communicate, leading up to, during the event and then beyond, and give people information about how to continue to reinforce, how to use the tool, et cetera. And then I like the idea of celebrating success. So once you're kind of past the main milestones and you're continuing to communicate, you're thanking your employees and leaders and managers and your change champions, because you can't do it without them. And a good, nice recognition, it doesn't have to be anything fancy or formal, but a thank you to really appreciate and recognize your associates, because they're all part of the change and going through the change curve. And it's not easy. So it's really nice when I see folks celebrating successes and milestones collectively.
Excellent, excellent. And such an important point, Mary, in terms of communicating beyond the change. So to keep that consistent impact. Well, thank you both so very much. We could go on and on with this topic. There's just so much to it. I also want to thank our audience. You've provided some wonderful insights and reinforcement and points in chat. And I encourage you all to join next month's Power Speaking Live event, which is going to be on the subject of cross-cultural communication and how to get it and ensure you're doing it in a very inclusive way. So thank you again.